There is a particular kind of tiredness that arrives not in the body but in the mind. The kind where you close your eyes and the weight of the day presses gently against the back of your eyelids, and the room has gone quiet. But the thinking has not. The thoughts that come in those final minutes before sleep are not random. They are, research now suggests, the last thing your brain chooses to keep. You are lying in a room that has gone quiet. The day has ended, or it seems to have. But somewhere in the architecture of your nervous system, something is still awake, still deciding. What you let yourself think about in the 5 minutes before sleep may shape who you are when you open your eyes tomorrow. Welcome to Psychology for Sleep. Let the body settle where it is. Notice the weight of your hands. There is a question tonight about what the mind holds in the dark. And the answer begins here. And now we begin. You have probably noticed that some mornings feel decided before they begin, that the mood greeting you at waking does not seem to arrive fresh, but already formed, already tilted toward heaviness or ease. Sleep researchers call this emotional priming, and what they have found is that the emotional tone of the final waking moments does not simply disappear at sleep onset. It enters the brain's consolidation queue. The thoughts held during hypnagogia, the soft threshold state between waking and sleep, are processed differently than thoughts held earlier in the day, tagged by theta oscillations as high-priority material for the night's memory work. This is not a metaphor. It is a mechanism, and tonight is an invitation to understand it. Hypnagogia is the technical name for that dissolving state you enter in the minutes before sleep, when thinking becomes loosely associative. Images begin to flicker at the edges of awareness, and the grip of ordinary logic softens into something more fluid. Brain scans reveal that during this transition, the hippocampus and the amygdala enter a period of heightened communication, replaying fragments of recent emotional experience with unusual intensity. What the brain chooses to rehearse at this crossing is not random. It follows an emotional gradient. What felt most unresolved, most charged, most incomplete in the hours before sleep gets the most sustained attention in the opening cycles of the night. The word hypnagogia comes from the Greek hypnos, meaning sleep, and agogos, meaning leading toward. It is, in the most literal sense, the passage into sleep, a doorway the brain never simply walks through, but lingers in, sorting what the day has left behind, deciding what deserves the night's attention. A 2024 review published in Trends in Neuroscience described hypnagogia not as a passive transition, but as an active processing state, one in which the boundary between autobiographical memory and present experience becomes permeable enough for the brain to rearrange both, not randomly, but according to emotional weight and the urgency of what remains unresolved. Research on what scientists call the day residue, the way today's events reappear at the edge of sleep, has found that approximately 40% of dreams incorporate material from the immediately preceding day. But this is not simply replay. A July 2025 study published in Communications Biology mapped the neural sources of day residue processing during hypnagogia and found that visual and emotional aspects of recent experience are handled by separate but interacting circuits involving cortical, subcortical, and cerebellar structures across both hemispheres. The emotional residue fades faster than the visual, but what fades and what endures depends significantly on the state of the nervous system at sleep onset. There is a system in the brain called the default mode network, active when you are not focused on any specific external task, active during self-reflection, active during mind-wandering, active in the quiet moments between demands. It is most reliably engaged in 2 predictable windows of each day, just after external obligations release their grip, and just before sleep takes hold. These are the moments when the brain does its deepest editorial work, reviewing what the day contained, assigning weight to what happened, deciding what matters enough to carry forward. What you are thinking about when the default mode network is at its most active becomes the raw material for the night's consolidation work. You may have experienced this. The way a worry rehearsed at bedtime has a particular stickiness by morning, as though it has been pressed into something more solid overnight. This is not a personality flaw or a failure of willpower. A study published in Frontiers in Psychology found that participants who spent 5 minutes before sleep ruminating on intrusive thoughts were significantly more likely to dream about threatening events, suggesting that pre-sleep mental content influences not just sleep quality, but the emotional register of the entire night. The mind is not a computer that shuts down. It is a library that reorganizes while the lights are off. And the last thing you placed on the desk is the first thing the night's librarian picks up. The cortisol awakening response is a phenomenon that unfolds in the first 30 to 40 minutes after waking. A sharp, natural rise in cortisol that primes the brain's emotional and cognitive systems for the demands of the coming day. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in December 2024 used pharmacological neuroimaging and network modeling to show that this morning, cortisol surge actively reconfigures functional indice brain networks, enhancing emotional discrimination and working memory before the day's first real challenges arrive. What sets the tone of this response, in part, is what was consolidated overnight, which is shaped, in turn, by what you were thinking in the minutes when you fell asleep. Studies tracking this connection have found that individuals who ruminate or worry habitually show a more pronounced cortisol awakening response on mornings preceding demanding days. Research by Schlotz and colleagues found that participants with higher chronic worry and work overload showed elevated morning cortisol on weekdays compared to weekends, when anticipated demands were lower. Separately, studies on anticipated next-day cognitive demands found that simply knowing a demanding task awaited the following morning was sufficient to elevate the cortisol awakening response, even when sleep itself was undisturbed. The body prepares for a difficult day it has been briefed about. This is not fatalism. It is biology. And biology can be worked with once you can see what is happening. Theta waves, brain oscillations cycling between 4 and 8 times per second, emerge naturally during hypnagogia and are closely associated with the tagging of memories for overnight processing. A 2025 preprint study, not yet peer-reviewed at time of writing, found that theta oscillations during pre-sleep learning predicted which memories received priority consolidation overnight, higher theta activity at the moment of encoding, meaning the more emotionally engaged you were when a thought or event occurred, corresponded to stronger and more durable memory processing during sleep. This finding extends an established body of work on theta's role in memory tagging. Applied specifically to the pre-sleep window, what you rehearse with emotional intensity in those final minutes is precisely what theta marks for the night's first attention. And this is only the beginning of what the hypnagogic state reveals about the way tonight's worry. The quiet, familiar worry that tomorrow will be another difficult day actually works at a neural level. That worry does not simply pass through you and dissolve into the dark. It is registered, tagged, and filed by a system that will spend the next several hours working on it, returning to it across multiple sleep cycles, each time with slightly different neurochemical conditions and slightly different processing outcomes. What follows across this hour is the science of what that work actually involves. The amygdala, the brain's primary emotional processing structure, is disproportionately active during REM sleep, the stage characterized by rapid eye movements and vivid dreaming that recurs in cycles throughout the night. During waking hours, the prefrontal cortex typically moderates the amygdala's responses, keeping emotional reactions roughly proportionate to actual events. During REM sleep, this moderating relationship loosens considerably. The prefrontal cortex becomes relatively quiet, and the amygdala becomes more expressive, more associative, more likely to draw emotional connections across unrelated memories. What this means is that emotional material processed during REM carries more weight, more texture, more persistence than the same content processed while awake. Researchers at UC Irvine published work in Scientific Reports in May 2024, examining how dream recall and next morning mood affected memory consolidation and emotion regulation across the following day. The central finding was a prioritization effect. Emotionally charged memories were processed first and most thoroughly across the night, and their emotional intensity was also measurably reduced through that same processing. Memories that arrived at the entry point with the most charge did not emerge unchanged. Sleep, in this model, is not a passive archive that stores what arrives unchanged. It is an active editorial system that preserves the content of what mattered while steadily reducing the urgency attached to it. The serotonin and norepinephrine systems, which regulate mood, alertness, and emotional tone throughout the waking day, become almost entirely quiet during REM sleep, dropping to their lowest levels of the 24-hour cycle. Acetylcholine, by contrast, rises during REM to levels approximately 4 times higher than during non-REM sleep, and roughly double those measured during quiet, relaxed waking. This dramatic neurochemical shift is what gives REM sleep its distinctive quality as an emotional processing window. The memory's emotional charge can be genuinely modified under these conditions in ways that are simply not physiologically available during wakefulness. When the alerting and arousal systems remain too active, this processing effect is sometimes described through what sleep researchers call the emotional memory consolidation hypothesis. The idea that REM sleep functions in part as a processing stage that gradually separates the factual content of a memory from its raw emotional charge. The result is that you can wake remembering what happened while feeling differently about it than you did when it occurred. This process requires a full night of sleep, an intact REM architecture, and this is the element that receives less attention than it deserves. A nervous system that was not already overloaded when sleep began, because the mechanism is sensitive to the conditions at entry. There is a concept in neuroscience called the tagging and replay system. The idea that experiences carrying emotional significance are tagged during waking by theta oscillations in the hippocampus, then replayed during sleep in cycles that gradually transfer them from short-term hippocampal storage to distributed longer-term cortical networks. Research from 2024 in animal models showed that sleep sharp-wave ripples, brief, high-frequency bursts of neural activity associated with consolidation, preferentially replayed maze trajectories that had been connected to reward during waking rather than neutral paths. The consolidation system is selective. It knows what mattered during the day, and it returns to that material first. The hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex show enhanced functional connectivity during sleep following emotional learning. A measurable increase in communication between these two regions that corresponds to how well emotional memories are integrated and given interpretive context overnight. After a night of sleep, recollection of emotionally significant material is associated with stronger coordination between these regions and, at the same time, with reduced reactivity in the amygdala. The emotional memory is not erased by this process, and it is not diminished in accuracy. It is rerouted through circuits that allow it to be understood and contextually placed, rather than simply experienced again as raw threat. Sleep onset, that hypnagogic threshold, has been described by researchers at the Paris Brain Institute as a creative sweet spot, a state in which the rigid associative logic of waking thought loosens and unexpected connections between unrelated concepts become genuinely more accessible. A study published in Science Advances in 2021 demonstrated this experimentally, showing that subjects caught and briefly held at the hypnagogic stage were better at solving problems requiring creative leaps than those who had fallen into deeper sleep or remained fully awake. The same looseness that makes the state feel slightly unreliable is what makes it neurologically generative. At sleep onset, the brain is not falling apart. It is opening in ways that full waking will not allow. Studies using targeted dream incubation, a technique developed at the MIT Media Lab in which specific auditory cues are delivered during hypnagogia to introduce particular themes into early sleep mentation, have shown that content presented at this crossing reliably reappears in subsequent dream reports. A 2024 paper in Frontiers in Sleep extended this methodology to remote settings, confirming the principle across different populations and delivery conditions. The brain at sleep onset is not defended against new input in the way it is during full wakefulness. What arrives at the crossing at this moment does not wait at the door. It enters the processing stream directly. During hypnagogia, the imagetic residue of the day, the visual fragments of recent experience, tends to linger longer than the purely emotional residue under ordinary conditions, gradually fading as the transition to deeper sleep progresses. Research on how arousal state shapes pre-sleep processing suggests that when the nervous system enters sleep in a state of elevated tension, this typical pattern may shift, with emotional material persisting longer into early sleep stages rather than fading ahead of the visual content. The practical implication aligns with what other pre-sleep research consistently shows: the higher the arousal at sleep onset, the more emotionally loaded the material that enters the night's first processing cycles. There is a measurable difference between two people who fall asleep holding the same problem, one approaching it with curiosity, one approaching it with dread. Both will have the problem surface in overnight consolidation. The content is not filtered out simply because the emotional frame around it is negative, but the neurochemical environment at sleep onset influences which aspects of the problem receive the most processing time. How strongly the amygdala engages with the material during REM cycles. and what the prefrontal cortex's relationship to that material looks like by morning. The emotional frame carried into sleep matters as an independent variable. It shapes the conditions of the entire night's editorial work, not just its content. The sleep spindles of stage 2 non-REM sleep. Brief, rhythmic bursts of neural oscillation at 12 to 15 Hz, lasting less than 2 seconds, are associated with both memory consolidation and with the buffering of the sleeping brain against external disruption. People with higher spindle density consolidate procedural and emotional memories more effectively, and are less likely to be woken by noise or other environmental interference. Spindle density is influenced by the state of the nervous system at sleep onset. Elevated arousal at bedtime is associated with suppressed spindle activity, which reduces the overall quality of the night's memory work. The connection between pre-sleep thought and morning mood is not only psychological, it is structural and measurable at the level of neural circuit activity. The amygdala and the hippocampus communicate throughout the night in coupling patterns that are established in part by what was emotionally active at sleep onset. Research using functional connectivity analysis has shown that emotional memories rated as salient and unresolved at bedtime show stronger hippocampal-amygdala coupling during the early cycles of sleep, the same cycles that shape the emotional register of the night's first dreams. And through those first dreams, the emotional orientation that waking finds already assembled in the morning. There is a phenomenon called mood-congruent memory, the well-documented and reliably replicated finding that people recall information matching their current emotional state more readily than information that contradicts it. When you wake in a low mood, you are more likely to retrieve memories that confirm and deepen that low mood, creating a self-reinforcing pattern before the day's first real event has occurred. The morning emotional state that sleep consolidates becomes the interpretive lens through which the opening moments of the new day are perceived. This is not destiny, but it is a starting position, and it is set the night before. The brain does not process the final minutes before sleep the same way it processes the rest of the evening. The chemistry changes. The activity of the default mode network increases, and external sensory processing begins to withdraw. Electroencephalography studies show a measurable shift in neural signature as the body approaches sleep. The default mode network becomes more active. Peripheral attention narrows, and internal narrative generation intensifies. Whatever the mind is generating in those minutes, the stories it is telling about tomorrow, the feelings it is rehearsing about what happened today, are generated under conditions of heightened, self-referential processing. And the brain is giving them its full autobiographical attention. What these 25 facts have begun to reveal is not only about hypnagogia or memory consolidation in isolation. They are tracing something about the familiar worry that tomorrow will be another difficult day. That worry is not simply a habit of thought or a failure of optimism. It is a nightly input into a biological system designed to receive the emotional state of the evening, work on it throughout the night, and return a version of it to you in the morning. But a system shaped by input can be shaped differently. That is where this hour turns next. Psychology for Sleep has spent many quiet hours following this kind of question, the ones that live at the border between what we feel and what the brain is doing while we feel it. Tonight's hour is finding something worth following. Share it with one sleepy soul at a time. Let the weight of the body fall completely into the surface beneath you. If there is any thought still circling, not to push it away, but to notice it clearly for a moment. The brain is already listening to what this quiet contains. Let the breath arrive on its own. The concept of pre-sleep programming is not new to human experience. It is embedded in practices found across cultures and centuries. From evening prayer, to journaling, to the traditional instruction to count blessings before sleep. What contemporary neuroscience has contributed is not the insight itself, but the mechanism behind it. The mind's last content before sleep becomes the mind's first material for the night. Carried through the specific chemistry of hypnagogia and REM consolidation into the next morning's emotional orientation. The practice predates the explanation by thousands of years. A method called constructive worry, developed within cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, involves deliberately shifting pre-sleep mental content from open-ended rumination to structured problem engagement, rather than allowing worry to circle without resolution. The practice asks the person to write down a concern and identify one concrete next step, however small, before sleep. Research on related pre-sleep cognitive closure techniques suggests this kind of structured engagement reduces bedtime cognitive arousal and shifts the nervous system's anticipatory state before the consolidation process begins, moving the brain from threat monitoring toward forward orientation. The brain's default mode network, the self-referential system that becomes most active in the minutes before sleep, is also the network most closely associated with imagination, future planning, and the simulation of possible selves and scenarios. When it is occupied with threat anticipation and worst-case rehearsal, its imaginative function is constrained to a narrow range of negative possibility. When it receives different content, thought oriented toward what is resolvable, what was genuine, what is still open, its overnight work shifts accordingly. The default mode network does not distinguish between worrying about tomorrow and imagining tomorrow. It processes both as rehearsal for what the brain expects to meet. Sleep researchers have observed that mental engagement requiring mild cognitive absorption at bedtime, as distinct from passive worry or stimulating screen content, is associated with faster sleep onset and better sleep architecture. The mechanism appears to involve a gentle redirection of the default mode network away from self-referential threat processing and towards something that holds attention without heightening arousal. The brain is not being tricked in this process. It is being offered something more occupying than the open loop of an unresolved concern, and it accepts the offer. Body scan practices. The sequential, deliberate relaxation of attention through different regions of the body before sleep have measurable effects on the nervous system's state at sleep onset that go beyond subjective relaxation. Studies using heart rate variability monitoring show increased parasympathetic activity following body scan protocols, reflecting a genuine shift toward the regulatory arm of the autonomic nervous system. This shift changes the neurochemical environment in which hypnagogia occurs: lower norepinephrine, a reduced cortisol baseline, a physiological setting that favors the consolidation and integration functions of sleep over the vigilance and arousal functions that served the waking day. The body's release is real, and it is measurable. The pineal gland releases melatonin in response to decreasing ambient light, signaling to the brain and body that the biological night has begun and that the systems associated with sleep onset should prepare. Melatonin does not cause sleep directly. It prepares the conditions for sleep by lowering core body temperature, reducing alertness, and shifting the nervous system toward the receptive state of hypnagogia, artificial light exposure in the final hour before bed. Particularly short wavelength blue light, suppresses melatonin release and extends the high-arousal waking state, the state least conducive to a clean, settled entry into the hypnagogic state. The slow-wave sleep of the early night, dominated by delta oscillations below 4 Hz, is the period when the hippocampus most actively replays the day's stored experiences, transferring consolidated information to neocortical networks for longer-term storage. This replay is not random and does not treat all memories equally. It is preferentially directed toward information that was emotionally significant, novel, or experientially incomplete at the time of encoding. A thought held with unresolved tension at bedtime carries all 3 of those qualities simultaneously. It is precisely the kind of material the hippocampus is built to prioritize. During slow-wave sleep, the brain also engages channels that support the clearance of cellular metabolic byproducts. Research in animal models has consistently shown active waste clearance processes during sleep, and early human studies suggest a similar pattern may apply. Though the evidence in humans is still developing, and the mechanisms are not yet as fully mapped as in animal research, what the existing literature agrees on is that sleep quality in the early part of the night, when slow-wave sleep is concentrated, matters significantly for the brain's maintenance processes, and that the quality of entry into sleep influences the quality of slow-wave architecture. Waking up during the night, called sleep fragmentation, disrupts the normal architecture of sleep cycles and is associated in research with elevated inflammatory markers, reduced immune function, and significantly impaired next-day emotion regulation. Pre-sleep anxiety is one of the most consistent and well-replicated predictors of sleep fragmentation across populations. What makes this pattern particularly difficult is its feedback structure. The worry that generates fragmentation is often a worry about the very quality of sleep that the fragmentation then disrupts. A loop that, like most such loops in the nervous system, traces back to a state inherited from the evening before. The relationship between pre-sleep mental content and morning mood has been studied using ecological momentary assessment, a method in which participants rate their own mood at bedtime and again upon waking for multiple consecutive nights. The correlation between pre-sleep negative affect and morning negative affect is robust, replicable across different studies and populations, and holds even when controlling for sleep duration. But it is not deterministic. The correlation weakens significantly in participants with consistent pre-sleep practices, suggesting that the pathway between tonight's last thought and tomorrow's first feeling is real but genuinely modifiable. Research on gratitude practices before sleep has found measurable changes in both pre-sleep mental content and subsequent sleep quality in participants who adopted them. One key finding was a specificity effect participants who listed 3 specific, concrete, positive events from their day. A conversation that went well, a moment of unexpected ease, something small that felt right, showed more reduction in cognitive arousal at bedtime than those who listed 3 general positive attributes of their life. The brain responds differently to the rehearsal of concrete sensory memory than to abstract positive statement. A specific moment recalled with warmth occupies cognitive space that would otherwise be available for threat anticipation. The phenomenon of sleep-dependent insight, waking to find that a problem you carried to sleep has somehow clarified or resolved, has been documented across creative fields and studied in controlled laboratory settings. A study by Wagner and colleagues published in Nature in 2004 found that participants who slept between 2 sessions of working on a mathematical problem were significantly more likely to discover a hidden shortcut to the solution than those who remained awake for the same duration. The insight did not arrive during sleep. It was waiting at waking. Assembled from materials the night had reorganized without deliberate effort. The emotional tone of the hypnagogic state, the quality of feeling present as you cross into sleep, appears to predict the emotional tone of the first dreams of the night. Research tracking continuous EEG through sleep onset and early sleep has found that the effective quality of hypnagogic imagery correlates with the effective quality of subsequent dream reports. This continuity suggests that sleep onset is not a wall between 2 separate states. It is a passage. And what you carry through it does not stop at the door. In studies examining the bedtime thought patterns of people experiencing chronic worry, researchers found a consistent and somewhat counterintuitive pattern. The content of the worry was less predictive of subsequent sleep disruption than its form. Open-ended worry, rehearsing what might go wrong without any resolution, was significantly more disruptive to sleep onset than structured engagement with the same concern. The brain at this crossing responds to narrative form as well as emotional content. A thought that has an ending, even a provisional one, even a small next step, is processed differently than a thought that simply circles. The first 40 facts have built a connected portrait of a system that most people have never been shown: the hypnagogic threshold, the tagging process, the overnight consolidation cycle, the morning cortisol response, all of them forming a chain that begins in the final minutes before sleep. What you let your mind hold in those minutes is not a private experience that vanishes at sleep onset. It enters machinery that works throughout the night and returns to you in the morning in a form that has been shaped by what it found at the door. The body has been still for some time. The mind may have wandered. That is exactly what it is designed to do here. At this edge, notice that you are still present. The breath has continued without instruction. Something in you has been keeping the rhythm of the night without effort, without asking permission. The hippocampus encodes information during waking experience in temporal sequence. Events are stored in the order they occur, with the most recently encoded material occupying the most active and accessible positions in short-term hippocampal memory at any given moment. At sleep onset, the most recently encoded experiences are therefore also the most recently active in hippocampal firing patterns. This recency structure means that what happens in the final hour of the day and the final minutes before sleep occupies a privileged position in the architecture of the night's first consolidation cycle, regardless of how emotionally significant the earlier events of the day were. The phenomenon called the primacy-recency effect in memory research describes the well-established tendency to recall most reliably the first and last items in any sequence, at the expense of the middle. Applied to the emotional events of a full day, the morning and the bedtime carry disproportionate memorial weight in retrospective memory, compared to everything that happened between them. The day's first emotional experience and the day's last emotional experience are the ones most likely to define what the day was in retrospective recall. How you end the day is not a coda to the main performance. It is one of the main events in the record that sleep will process. Research on the neuroscience of self-talk has found that the internal verbal voice used in pre-sleep rumination activates many of the same neural circuits as the auditory perception of external speech. The language processing regions of the brain respond to internally generated verbal content with measurable activation intensity. This means that harsh, critical, or threat-oriented self-talk at bedtime engages the brain's threat detection circuits in ways that closely resemble what would happen if an external threatening voice were present in the room. The nervous system at this edge does not fully distinguish between what is imagined and what is real. It responds to the quality of what it generates. The brain during hypnagogia is in a state researchers sometimes describe as hyperassociative, more capable than during ordinary focused waking of forming connections between concepts that have no obvious logical relationship, more responsive to metaphor and symbolic thinking, more likely to follow emotional logic rather than causal logic. Content that enters this state does not stay in the form it arrived. It gets worked on by associative machinery that finds patterns, draws unexpected connections, and builds emotional meaning from whatever it encounters. A worry rehearsed at this crossing does not remain a discrete thought. It propagates through connected material. The practice of writing a to-do list for the next day before sleep, studied formally by Michael Scullin and colleagues at Baylor University, was found to help participants fall asleep significantly faster than participants who wrote about tasks they had already completed. The key mechanism identified was cognitive offloading, the act of transferring the open loops of uncompleted intention from active working memory to an external record, which reduces the brain's perceived need to keep those loops active. The mind that has placed its unfinished business somewhere it can be retrieved does not need to hold it through the night. The insular cortex, a region folded deep within the lateral sulcus of the brain, involved in interoception and the conscious perception of internal bodily states, is active during hypnagogia in ways that distinguish it from ordinary waking. This heightened insular activity is part of why the transition to sleep is often accompanied by vivid body sensations. Hypnic jerks, the sudden sense of falling, a wave of heaviness. At sleep onset, the insula is registering the body's shifting autonomic state with unusual attentiveness. And whether that registration reads the shift as safe or as threatening contributes meaningfully to the emotional character of the night's opening. A felt sense of safety at sleep onset, a reading by the nervous system that the body's environment is non-threatening, that the vigilance of the day can be at least partially released, is associated in research with longer slow-wave sleep, more consolidated REM architecture, and more favorable morning mood ratings. This safety signal is not simply about external circumstances. It is also constructed from within, from the quality of the mental content present at sleep onset, from the relationship to the body in those final minutes, from whether the nervous system has received any indication that the sustained alertness of the waking day is here, temporarily no longer required. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region involved in value processing, safety signaling, and the regulation of the amygdala's threat responses, shows altered activity patterns during hypnagogia compared to waking. When this region is operating in a regulatory capacity at sleep onset, it dampens the amygdala's threat processing and allows the early sleep cycles to proceed with lower emotional arousal. When the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is itself occupied by a worry that feels unresolvable, it cannot perform this regulating function effectively, and the amygdala enters the night's first consolidation cycle without its usual moderating influence in place. There is a quality of attention that exists in the space between deliberate focus and open wandering, described in contemplative and cognitive research as open monitoring, in which awareness is present and receptive but not effortful, observant without being fixated on any particular object. This quality of attention is neurologically adjacent to the hypnagogic state. Practices that cultivate open monitoring, certain forms of meditation, soft breath awareness without counting, attention resting on bodily sensation without analysis, guide the brain toward the hypnagogic state while reducing the informational load that arrives with it, offering the crossing a quieter mind to receive. The question this hour began with, why morning mood originates from the night before, is revealing itself as a question not really about sleep in isolation. It is a question about what the night inherits from the day, what state the nervous system is in when it crosses the threshold, what material the consolidation cycles find available, what the morning cortisol response is briefed to prepare for. The second part of this hour follows what the brain actually does with what it receives overnight, and what that means for the person who wakes in a room that is still dark and finds that something has shifted. The body has been still for a long time. Something has softened that was not soft at the beginning of this hour. Notice it, not to examine it, just to register that it is there. The night is already doing what it does. You do not need to direct it. REM sleep occurs in cycles of approximately 90 minutes, with each successive cycle carrying a progressively longer REM phase. The early night's first REM episode is typically brief, 5 to 10 minutes. The final REM cycle before natural waking may last 30 to 45 minutes. The emotional consolidation of the night is not a single event but a deepening sequence. Each pass returns to previously processed material from a slightly different neurochemical context, each time refining the emotional register of what was held. Dreams occurring in the later REM cycles of the night are typically longer, more narrative, more emotionally nuanced, and more likely to incorporate material from earlier in the person's life, not only the preceding day. This is thought to reflect the brain's work of contextualizing recent emotional experience within a longer autobiographical history, placing tonight's worry or grief inside the story of a life that has navigated and survived previous versions of similar difficulty. When sleep is cut short, these later consolidation cycles are the first to be lost. The emotional memory network, the interconnected system centered on the amygdala, hippocampus, medial prefrontal cortex, and anterior cingulate cortex, operates in a distinctive configuration during sleep compared to waking. The anterior cingulate cortex, associated with conflict detection during waking, appears to contribute to what might be described as the night's emotional editing, registering effective discordance in stored memories and generating the signal that emotional context requires updating. Sleep is, in this sense, the brain's nightly correction pass on the emotional assumptions the day produced. There is a phenomenon called emotional memory reconsolidation. The finding, supported across multiple studies, that when a stored memory is retrieved and made temporarily active, it enters a briefly unstable state during which its emotional content can be modified before the memory is restored in its updated form. Sleep provides repeated cycles of this kind of retrieval, through dreaming and through non-dream consolidation, each representing an opportunity for gentle revision. The memory of yesterday's difficult moment is not sealed. It is touched again each night, and each touching carries the possibility of a slightly different landing. During REM sleep, acetylcholine rises to levels that significantly enhance the hippocampus's capacity to encode new associations and modify existing ones. Simultaneously, norepinephrine, which carries the urgency and threat readiness of the waking day, drops to its lowest levels of the 24-hour cycle, removing the anxiety signal that makes emotional material feel threatening rather than workable. The combination of high neural plasticity and low threat arousal creates precisely the conditions under which emotional memories can be processed deeply without being reinforced in their original frightening form. The concept of sleep-dependent emotional toning, the gradual reduction in the emotional intensity of a memory across successive nights of sleep, has been demonstrated in controlled experimental settings. In studies where participants rated the emotional intensity of photographs before sleep and then again after waking, the after-sleep ratings consistently showed reduced intensity compared to matched waking periods of equal duration. Something specific to sleep, not simply the passage of time, was reducing the urgency attached to the emotional material while leaving the content itself intact. This toning effect is most pronounced for memories that were most emotionally activating at the time of encoding, precisely the memories that most reliably occupy the pre-sleep mind. The brain preferentially processes the most charged material, and in processing it, reduces its charge over successive nights. The worry that feels largest and most insistent at bedtime is, in this sense, the worry most specifically targeted by the night's consolidation machinery. Sleep does not ignore what troubles you. It brings its most intensive processing to bear on it. The phenomenon of sleep-dependent problem-solving has been replicated across multiple experimental designs and populations. What the research consistently demonstrates is not that sleep provides new information unavailable during waking. It is that sleep reorganizes the information already present into configurations that the alert, focused waking mind was too occupied to perceive. The brain in sleep can identify relational patterns that required stepping back from the problem to see. The answer was often always there. Sleep created the distance that made it visible. The orbitofrontal cortex, involved in reward evaluation, outcome expectation, and the updating of predictions based on accumulated experience, shows distinctive activation patterns during REM sleep that distinguish it from both non-REM sleep and waking. Research suggests this region participates in the nightly reweighting of emotional predictions, adjusting what the brain anticipates from situations that have been emotionally significant. A night of sleep may function, in this respect, as a recalibration of the brain's forecast for the coming day, revising expectations shaped by yesterday's emotional state. Research examining the relationship between habitual sleep quality and emotional resilience has found that people who report consistently better sleep show faster emotional recovery following negative events, not because they are less affected by difficult things, but because their brain's overnight processing is more complete before the next challenge arrives. The emotional residue of what was hard is reduced between days rather than accumulated across them. The recovery that in habitually poor sleepers may require several waking days is, in good sleepers, largely accomplished before morning. Slow oscillations during non-REM sleep, large, synchronized waves of neural activity traveling across the cortical surface, are associated with the progressive transfer of memory representations from the hippocampus to distributed neocortical networks for long-term storage. These oscillations are disrupted by noise, stress, and by the anticipatory cognitive arousal that characterizes pre-sleep worry. There is a particular irony in the structure of insomnia. The worry about whether sleep will be adequate disrupts the very slow-wave architecture that would otherwise have processed the worry. The anterior hippocampus, associated with emotional and contextual aspects of memory, and the posterior hippocampus, associated with spatial and sequential aspects, contribute differently to the night's memory work. Emotional memories engage the anterior hippocampus more heavily, which means they are processed in closer anatomical and functional proximity to the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex. Emotional memory, in other words, travels through a different channel than purely factual memory, one that is more directly linked to the regulatory circuits that will determine tomorrow's baseline emotional state. The concept of affective forecasting, the human capacity to predict how one will feel in a future situation, is known to be systematically biased in one consistent direction. People reliably overestimate how negative a bad event will feel and how long that feeling will persist. Sleep functions as a nightly correction of this forecasting error, reducing the emotional weight of recent negative events so that each new day begins from a more accurate baseline. Disrupted or insufficient sleep leaves this correction incomplete, and the overestimated weight of yesterday persists into today. There is a direct and measurable biological connection between the quality of the pre-sleep period and the morning cortisol awakening response. Studies tracking participants across multiple nights have found that individuals who experienced elevated negative affect before sleep showed reliably higher cortisol upon waking than on nights preceded by more settled pre-sleep states. The cortisol awakening response is, in a precise biological sense, a briefing prepared by the brain's overnight processing of whatever emotional state arrived at the crossing the night before. A message from last night to this morning. The relationship between sleep and emotional regulation is bidirectional. Poor sleep impairs the capacity for emotional regulation the following day, and impaired emotional regulation at bedtime degrades the quality of sleep that follows. But this relationship is asymmetric in one important respect. The leverage available at the entry into sleep is disproportionately large. The quality of the pre-sleep period, those final minutes before crossing the threshold, carries more influence over the night's consolidation work than almost any other single factor in the 24-hour cycle. Research using polysomnography, the comprehensive overnight monitoring of brainwaves, eye movements, muscle activity, and breathing, has found that individuals with anxiety disorders show characteristic alterations in sleep microarchitecture, more frequent and longer awakenings, reduced slow-wave sleep, more fragmented and less consolidated REM. These architectural changes are associated with reduced next-day capacity for emotional regulation, but interventions specifically targeting the pre-sleep period, reducing cognitive and physiological arousal at bedtime, have been shown to improve these architectural patterns, suggesting the structure of the night is genuinely sensitive to what quality arrived at its door. There is something sleep researchers describe as a recency advantage. In the context of overnight consolidation, the most recently experienced emotional material has privileged access to the first consolidation cycle of the night because it is most recently active in hippocampal circuitry. This recency advantage interacts with what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, the well-replicated tendency of the mind to maintain uncompleted tasks in active working memory until they are either resolved or consciously released. The open loops of the day, unfinished conversations, unresolved uncertainties, occupy this recency-advantaged position at bedtime, and the hippocampus gives them priority. A practice that directly addresses the Zeigarnik effect is what researchers call cognitive closure before sleep. The deliberate act of marking the day's unresolved business as known, acknowledged, and assigned to tomorrow, rather than leaving it in an active open-loop state. This is not the same as solving the problem. It is the act of changing the problem's cognitive status from open and unresolved to held and intended. A status change that research suggests is sufficient to reduce the hippocampus's perceived urgency around the material, lowering its priority in the night's first consolidation pass. The social baseline theory of emotion, developed by psychologist James Cohen, proposes that the human nervous system evolved to operate most efficiently in the presence of trusted social partners, and that perceived social connection at any given moment reduces the metabolic cost of threat processing. Applied to pre-sleep states the felt sense of being known, cared for, or accompanied, even in memory, even in imagination, even in the quiet recollection of a moment when someone was genuinely present, shifts the nervous system toward the parasympathetic orientation most conducive to restorative sleep. Remembered connection is biologically real. Studies tracking mood across consecutive nights using objective sleep measurement alongside subjective mood reporting have produced a finding that is both consistent and quietly important people with intact sleep architecture, including those with anxiety or depression, show on average a measurable improvement in mood between bedtime and waking. Morning mood is typically better than the mood that entered sleep. When the night is allowed to do what it is built to do, its direction, biologically, is toward restoration. The concept of a sleep dividend, the idea that consecutive nights of adequate, quality sleep accumulate as a reserve of emotional and cognitive resilience that is drawn on when demands are high, has been proposed in the sleep literature as a way of understanding individual differences in stress response. This dividend is not a fixed neurological trait. It is a resource that can be built across weeks and months by improving the conditions under which sleep is entered. Each night that enters sleep in a more settled state adds to the reserve. The neural circuits underlying fear, memory consolidation, and fear extinction, the learning process by which a previously frightening association loses its power, share many of the same structures: the amygdala, the hippocampus, the infralimbic cortex of the medial prefrontal cortex. REM sleep has been shown to support both processes, but under different conditions: consolidation of a new fear when the experience is recent and unprocessed, support for extinction when the person has had exposure to the feared situation and some degree of corrective experience. Sleep does not simply preserve what it finds. It adjusts what it keeps based on what you have been doing with the material. Schema-dependent encoding is the process by which new information is stored in the brain, not in isolation, but within the context of existing knowledge frameworks, making new learning richer, more connected, and more durable when it has prior structures to attach to. Overnight consolidation includes an updating of these schemas based on new information. A fact learned before sleep is often better integrated with prior knowledge by morning than it was at encoding. Applied to emotional schemas, the brain's working models of how situations like this one tend to go. Sleep offers nightly opportunities to revise the model based on evidence the day provided. The relationship between what you hold before sleep and what you carry into waking is not deterministic in either direction. It is probabilistic, shaped by the interaction of arousal level, prior sleep history, neurochemical state, environmental conditions, and the quality of the mental content itself. The brain at the hypnagogic threshold is not a machine that locks in a fixed output from a fixed input. It is a living system with significant processing capacity, responsive to what it is given. What you give it in those final minutes has genuine influence over what it produces. That influence is not absolute, but it is real. The brain uses sleep to consolidate the final thoughts of the day into something more durable than memory. Not a record, not a photograph, but an orientation toward the morning, a setting of expectation, a calibration of the systems that will meet tomorrow. What you bring to the crossing does not vanish at sleep onset. It becomes part of the building material for the next version of the day. The remaining facts in this hour carry a different quality. They are no longer constructing the case. They are describing what it feels like to live inside it. Let the breath arrive without being asked. There is nothing left to hold. The science has named what the body already knows, that the night is a process, not a pause, and that you are already inside it. Let the weight of the day become the weight of the body, settling into the surface beneath you. There is no further instruction, only this: the threshold is here, and the night is ready. There is a moment most people have felt, when the effort of staying awake becomes more effortful than simply releasing into the dark. That moment is the threshold the brain has been preparing for since the last light of the day. The one the whole architecture of the night was arranged to reach. Everything required is already in place. The brain's consolidation of emotional memory is not a judgment about what deserves to be kept or released. It is a service the night offers without preference. Whatever arrived at the threshold, the worry, the open question, the small unexpected kindness of the afternoon, is carried through the same process. Without editorial ranking, the brain is not working against you in the dark. It is working on what you gave it. A good night's sleep does not require that everything was fine in the hours before it. It requires only that the nervous system found, somewhere in the final approach, enough safety to begin the release, enough signal that the vigilance of the day could, for a few hours, loosen. Even a single moment of genuine ease before sleep changes the conditions at the entry point. The machinery is flexible. It works with what it receives. The morning does not arrive already formed, waiting behind a door. It is assembled from materials processed overnight, emotional residue reduced, memories integrated, the brain's expectation for the day recalibrated by the chemistry of sleep. Morning mood is not the truth about tomorrow. It is the brain's current estimate, built from the best available evidence the night could work with. What that evidence was is, in part, what this hour has been about. Theta oscillations, the brain rhythms that tag memories for overnight priority, are generated in the hippocampus and propagate through circuits connecting to the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the anterior cingulate cortex. These are also the circuits that generate the sense of self, the felt sense of tomorrow, the capacity to imagine what might still be possible. What gets tagged by Theta tonight is not only filed as memory, it becomes woven into the architecture of who you are when you wake. The sleep that follows a day of genuine effort, the kind where something was attempted, however imperfectly, where the day was actually inhabited, carries different material into the consolidation process than the sleep that follows a day of avoidance. The hippocampus has more to work with. The dream cycles have richer material for their processing. There is a version of tiredness that comes after real engagement with the day, and it is a tiredness that sleeps well. The brain during REM does not experience time in its ordinary linear form. Memories from this morning and memories from several years ago can surface in the same dream cycle, connected not by chronology, but by emotional logic, by what they share in feeling, in unresolved meaning, in the shape of the question they both contain. This is not disorder. It is the mechanism by which recent experience is placed inside the longer story of a life, given the context that makes it something other than simply painful. Research on individuals who identify as morning people has found that their apparent natural advantage is less fixed and neurological than it might seem. It is substantially shaped by accumulated sleep quality and by the practices that precede sleep over time. The brain that wakes easily and well is, in significant measure, the brain that was received cleanly into sleep the night before. The quality of the morning is made, in part, in the quality of the evening. A night of sleep after a difficult emotional event reduces the self-reported distress associated with the memory, without reducing the memory itself. The event is remembered. The intensity of what it felt like is reduced. This is the ordinary daily work of a system that evolved not to erase what happened, but to ensure you could remain functional for what comes next. Because what comes next also requires your presence. And your presence requires that yesterday does not consume all the space. There is no version of this science that requires perfection at bedtime. No prescription for the exact right thought or the exact right feeling as the eyes close. The brain does not need the last thought to be beautiful or resolved or wise. It needs only enough settling that the threshold can be crossed. Enough release for the night's systems to find their rhythm. Everything after that crossing is handled by processes that have been running longer than any worry you have ever had. The hypnagogic state, that threshold, is not something the brain stumbles into by accident. It is the destination of a biological arc that begins with the day's first light. Every shift in cortisol, every rise of adenosine, every hour of accumulated sleep pressure building quietly toward this moment. By the time the eyes close, the brain has been preparing for this crossing for the entire waking day. Through every hour, through every demand, it arrives here ready. The worry that the next day will bring more difficulty than you can manage is, in the language of the nervous system, a prediction, a forecast generated from available evidence. Predictions update over time. They update through experience, through evidence, through mornings that arrive differently than the worry anticipated. Sleep is part of that update cycle. The mechanism by which yesterday's worst case is metabolized into today's more accurate baseline. The nervous system, given time. 2. Revise. The emotional quality of hypnagogia is influenced by the body's physical orientation. Lying down alters the relationship between the vestibular system and brainstem nuclei in ways that promote parasympathetic activity. The choice to be horizontal, to close the eyes, to be still. These are not passive surrenders. They are active biological signals to a system that reads posture as information about the state of the world. The body's stillness says the vigilance is no longer needed here. The nervous system, receiving that signal, begins to adjust accordingly. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflict, signals errors, and generates the need for adjustment, is particularly active in people who carry high pre-sleep rumination into the night. But this same region is also associated with empathy, self-compassion, and the recognition that effort has been made. It is not an adversary. It is a region with a priority list that sleep, over time and with the right conditions, gently recalibrates toward what actually requires attention and away from what is only predicted threat. Research tracking the long-term effects of sleep improvement interventions on mood and anxiety has consistently found that improving sleep, even when mood or anxiety are not directly targeted in the treatment, produces measurable reductions in both. The influence travels in both directions, but it travels. Better sleep builds the platform from which emotional regulation operates. The night is not a passive background to the emotional life. It is one of the places where the emotional life is most actively shaped. In the REM sleep of people who have recently experienced significant loss, dream content often incorporates the person or thing that was lost. This is not a symptom of something wrong. It appears to be part of the brain's normal process of integrating a reality that has no precedent in the existing emotional schema. The grief appears in dreams, not despite the processing, but as evidence of it. The night works on the hardest things, not to resolve them quickly, but to make them livable over time. There is a particular quality that belongs to the morning after genuinely restorative sleep. Not the heaviness of exhaustion endured, but the lightness of something moved through. The body registers the difference. The brain registers it. The morning after a good night is not merely the absence of fatigue. It contains something that was not there the evening before, a mild readiness, a slight open quality to what comes. Something arrived in the dark while the thinking mind was still. Pre-sleep mental content does not need to be carefully optimized or deliberately positive to support good sleep. It needs to be settled, arrived at a place where the urgency of the open loop has reduced enough for the nervous system to release its grip. Settling is not happiness. It is not resolution. It is the state of having found, at least temporarily, the edge of what can be held tonight, and placed the rest somewhere it will still be there in the morning. The neurochemical tide that carries the waking mind towards sleep. Falling cortisol, rising melatonin, quieting norepinephrine, moves every night without instruction, without requiring that you prepare it or earn it. This tide was not designed for ideal conditions. It runs through difficulty, through worry, through ordinary difficult days. The practices and habits that support it are not imposing something artificial on the body. They are moving with a process that has its own momentum. As old as the species, as reliable as the dark. The connection between the last moments of waking and the first moments of the next morning is not a metaphor. It is a biological arc. Hypnagogia, slow wave consolidation. REM, processing. Cortisol, awakening response. Each stage shaped by the stage before it. Each carrying something forward from what was present at the crossing. What is given to the threshold is given, in some form, to the whole arc of the night. What the arc delivers in the morning carries the shape of what it was given. There is a version of bedtime worry, but is not only fear, it is also care. The mind rehearsing possible difficulties because it is trying, in its way, to protect something that matters. The science does not ask you to stop caring. It asks only whether the caring, at this particular hour, needs to stay in this particular form, or whether it might be set down in a shape the night can work with more gently, and that delivers something more useful to the morning. Every brain that arrives at the hypnagogic threshold tonight carries the same biological invitation to release the functions that served the waking day into the care of the functions built for the night. The consolidation circuits, the slow oscillations, the REM cycles, the Theta networks. They are already assembled and waiting. They require no additional preparation, no special condition, no particular resolution to what the day left unfinished. They need only to be allowed to begin. The morning mood that will arrive in the hours ahead has not yet been determined. The night is still working. What this hour has offered, this slow passage through the science of hypnagogia, of memory, of the quiet machinery of sleep, is itself a kind of pre-sleep content, a different quality of thought occupying the threshold than the thought that would otherwise have been there. The crossing has been held differently tonight. That difference enters the system. Tomorrow will be assembled from what the night has been working on. Materials that were already here when this hour began. Materials that arrived across the last 2 hours of science and stillness and the gradual descent toward sleep. The brain does not distinguish by origin. It works with what is present. What was present tonight is different from what might have been present otherwise. That difference is real, even if it cannot be measured. The answer is not that the brain programs the future during sleep, not with certainty, not with control. The answer is quieter than that you are not as separate from tomorrow as the worry sometimes makes it feel. The last thing held before sleep travels through the night and returns in the morning changed, not fixed, not solved, but touched by hours of processing. Tonight, what was held here was this, and this is what the night will carry forward. Something shifted in how the worry about tomorrow sits. Not smaller, necessarily, but different, because it has a mechanism now. And a mechanism can be worked with. The night is not indifferent to what you bring to it. It has systems designed to receive exactly what feels most unresolved. The last thought, the lingering question, the quiet dread that hasn't found its answer yet. You came here tonight carrying something about tomorrow. What this hour found is that the brain already knew. The consolidation systems, the theta rhythms, the slow oscillations. None of it was waiting for you to solve the problem first. It was waiting for you to arrive with it, which you did. The night already has what it needs from you. But knowing that the threshold shapes the morning is only the first half. The question the next video follows is harder if the last 5 minutes matter this much. Why is it so difficult to choose what fills them? Even when you know the next video in Reprogram Your Subconscious While You Sleep begins there. If tonight found the part of you that lies awake rehearsing tomorrow before it arrives, a quiet like or subscribe carries this hour to someone lying awake in the same way right now. One quiet tap, one sleepy soul at a time. You can allow these thoughts to settle now, like the last tension in a room that has finally decided it is safe to be still. Let your body be heavy with whatever this day asked of it. If sleep comes, let it carry you toward the morning. This hour has already begun to build. But if your eyes are closed, stay there. Rest well. Sleepy souls. The night was never indifferent to what you brought it. Good night.